Now, restoration is appealing. For those here in Europe, I'm sure there is a sigh, breathing a sigh of relief with this restorationist enterprise that is underway in the United States, in Washington. But there's a risk in this mindset, as many have pointed out, because during the Trump administration, the world has moved on, in many cases without the United States. And the credibility of American commitments after the Trump administration are seriously in question. So let me turn to the second alternative, which I mentioned in the title of my talk, which will affect the attitudes and actions of those outside the United States as well. Rejection. Is there, and here the central question, is there a domestic political basis for US leadership in global governance? Could American re-engagement and participation in a multilateral order be reversed once again, as it was under Trump? And let's consider the two political parties here. The Democrats, despite an intention to divide between the moderates and the progressives in wings in the party, I would argue are far more united than the Republican Party. But the glue in the party is in many ways its bias toward restoration and concentration on a domestic agenda set by the pandemic and by the need for economic recovery. Much of the foreign policy divide within the Democratic Party is associated with two issues: military intervention in foreign conflicts, which would be unlikely under the Biden administration. President Biden himself, even during the Obama administration when he was vice president, was far more realist about the possibilities of nation building than others in the administration. And the second issue that divides the two wings of the party is trade, which is much more prominent in the American debate, at least within the party, than it is here in Europe, I think. And it's an issue where the Biden administration is likely to tread very carefully. Here, the stance of the administration toward the WTO and some of the more egregious protectionist measures of the Trump administration, such as the steel and aluminum tariffs imposed on grounds of national security, will be indicators of its future course. The quiet acceptance of the United States of 𝗿𝗲𝗀𝗀𝗰𝗁𝗿𝗀𝗀𝗀 as the new Director General of the WTO, after the vetoing of her appointment by the Trump administration, suggests a more conciliatory line toward the WTO. But progress in global trade under the Biden administration is likely to be slow. It's likely to be plurilateral, not multilateral, although ideally those plurilateral negotiations would take place under a WTO umbrella. Now, the Republican Party, the opposition party, at least in terms of the presidency, and both houses of Congress at the moment, since the election has become much more problematic. President Biden, in his remarks, mentioned that democracy is under assault around the globe, but also internally. And it's clear that the Republican Party in the United States is now divided between a minority of the leadership who wish to distance themselves from Trump and his destructive and subversive course in rejecting the election results, and a majority of the congressional party and the party activists who appear to embrace him and his policies even more closely. This has not only foreign policy implications, but implications for the future of American democracy, which was alluded to by President Biden. The attack on the US Capitol on January 6th opened a new chapter in the shift of the Republican Party toward an explicitly anti-democratic stance and alignment with violent groups on the far right. From outside the United States, this bears very close observation. Will the opposition party in the United States, which did not do badly in the 2020 election, and certainly in the congressional elections, will it continue on this path? Will it adopt Trumpism without Trump, as some of the ambitious younger leaders hope? Or will it revert to a more conventional social and economic conservatism, personified by the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell? A center-right opposition party that accepts democratic norms is needed for a vigorous democracy. Will the United States have one? I think that is the open question that we confront in the United States. The polarization between the parties is promoted by the stark divide in the country between urban and rural locations, which has only deepened in the 2020 election. And the level of mobilization of the political parties on either side of the polarized divide was extremely high. The turnout in the US election was higher than it had been in recent elections by far. Now, counter to this rather pessimistic view of division and its implications for a future rejection by the United States of leadership in global governance, and a rejection by the rest of the world of US foreign policy and its efforts to exert leadership, I would point to two possible reasons for optimism. First, building bipartisanship may be more possible than you would think, given the polarization in the political system. There was, even under President Trump, there was a surprising degree of bipartisanship in Congress on foreign policy issues, often in opposition to Trump's more isolationist positions. There was, for example, a very important override of his veto when there was an attempt to cut the budget for the State Department and other international affairs agencies, in which Republicans and Democrats joined hands to override his veto. There's also been bipartisanship on human rights, and perhaps less usefully or less positively on China. But bipartisanship does not generally extend to climate change, trade, and other issues. A second reason for some degree of optimism is the high degree of support in public surveys, the general public, not party activists, for international engagement on the part of the US. Every survey has confirmed this. There is very little evidence of an isolationist wave that would support a return to Trump's predilections, even on trade. Now, it's important to note the public takes cues from its leadership, as it does here in Europe. And so these attitudes can shift as leaders shift their positions. The Republican Party has become much more protectionist under Trump, for example, because Trump was sending cues to the party that protectionism was where he wanted it to go. Nevertheless, there is a broad public support for US engagement of a more modest sort and a non-military sort in global affairs and global governance. So let me turn then to the last aspect, which is redesign, the possibility that the United States can engage in a redesign of its own foreign policy and global governance. Those who are more critical of past US foreign policy, for example, the catastrophic intervention in Iraq, the global financial crisis, and also critical of the restorationist bent of the Biden administration, excuse me, make the argument that restoration is not enough, that American foreign policy requires a redesign, which could be either radical or incremental, and that is required going forward. Jessica Matthews, in a recent Foreign Affairs article, argued that American foreign policy, once again, should not just be restored or attempt at restoration as it was under President Obama. It has to be, as she put it, remade. Now, when you get to the details of what this remaking would look like, however, there's, I think, considerable disagreement and a certain amount of lack of detail, I suppose would be the best way to put it. But let me suggest some ways that some shapes that this redesign might take place within the political constraints in the United States and within the constraints that the international system and our partnerships with Europe and other parts of the world impose as well. One area of redesign is making clear and positive connections between foreign policy and a foreign policy of international engagement with citizens and their daily lives. There's a very interesting Carnegie Endowment report that appeared last year entitled Making US Foreign Policy Work Better for the Middle Class. It's based on extensive interviews and research in 3 case study states, Colorado, Nebraska, and Ohio, which are chosen to be in the middle of the country, not on the coast where most of the foreign policy elite tend to live. And it offers some very detailed suggestions on foreign economic policy and how it can be connected to the daily lives of citizens. But on national security and defense, the connections between foreign policy and the daily lives of citizens seems rather remote in that report. One recommendation that is important, however, and would be an important part of a redesign, is recognizing the localized impact of globalization on communities and developing community-based policies to aid with adjustment and resilience in the face of shocks, such as the China trade shock, which affected both Europe and the United States. This is an enterprise that has been underway at the Brookings Institution. It may be a theme of the Biden administration. It is something that I think many scholars in Europe are considering. But our local and regional economic policies designed to deal with the effects of globalization and to support internationalist economic policies is something that clearly needs a redesign and to be made more successful. Now, these demands for domestic rebuilding and the current debate in Washington over the Biden administration's stimulus program centers on exactly that issue. How do we rebuild better domestically? Means that likely the United States must do more internationally with less resources, but also perhaps less attention on the part of the foreign policy elite. If rebuilding domestic support in an environment of polarization and reduced trust in public institutions is important, rebuilding and expanding international coalitions will also be important in any redesign of American foreign policy. The temptation in Washington will be to build those coalitions against authoritarian powers, particularly China. And here I can report to you, as I'm sure you are all aware, based on your work in this project, that even before the Trump administration, but certainly during the Trump administration, the hardening of attitudes toward China across the board in the political spectrum has been quite marked. So the temptation in Washington, as I said, will be to build these broader coalitions against authoritarian powers, particularly China. And China does represent a challenge for the US, for the EU, and for global governance. The Carnegie Report argues that the United States public supports, quote, managing strategic competition with China to mitigate the risk of destabilizing conflict and counter its efforts toward economic and technological hegemony. Well, that's quite an important statement, and it's also an extremely difficult policy stance to implement. If you unpack that recommendation, you discover its difficulty. And largely the difficulty lies in the fact that the United States and Europe have never confronted an authoritarian power on the scale of China, with which they are also so economically interdependent. As repression in China, directed toward its minority Uyghur and Tibetan populations, and in Hong Kong has intensified, the democracies of Europe and the United States cannot turn a blind eye. Deciding on measures that are more than symbolic, however, is very difficult. In relations with China and Russia, the imposition of sanctions always confronts the trade-off between costs imposed on our own economies versus effectiveness in changing the policies of these states. Sanctions are politically difficult as well, since powerful business interests weigh in to argue against more stringent sanctions, and the public has little appetite for a new Cold War on ideological lines directed against these countries, and shutting them off even more from the rest of the world. One principle is clear, however: policies to influence China and Russia will be more effective if the rules of coexistence, engagement, and collaboration are shared by the United States, Europe, and their democratic allies. Does this imply a League of Democracies or a Summit of Democracies, which is one of the Biden administration's planned initiatives? Many have pointed out that attempting to parade the United States as a paragon of democracy after the events of the past year, and also after our dismal performance during the pandemic, would probably not be a successful strategy. Rebuilding and deepening democracy within the existing liberal democracies is important, but that must also include action against democratic backsliding within the clubs of democracies, whether those clubs are the EU or NATO. And here, both organizations have been notably weak against democratic backsliding within. Other steps that could be taken include drawing clear red lines and protecting nonviolent dissidents who take refuge within our democratic precincts, where they are often under attack by their home governments. Democratic spaces should be off limits to such violence, and attacks of such kinds should continue to be sanctioned. A third step could be supporting civil society organizations and journalists who are also under threat from their governments, even within democracies, as the recent arrest of environmental activist 𝗿𝗲𝗷𝗶𝗱 Ravi in India makes clear. Strengthening the transnational network of civil society organizations is a critical element in the success of global governance and a challenge to authoritarian regimes and backsliding from democracy. Global governance also plays another important role in enabling the United States and Europe to challenge authoritarian regimes on issues that have wide global appeal, such as mitigating climate change and promoting sustainable development. And here I would mention another global issue that has been central to popular movements around the world, and one in which a challenge could be mounted within global governance institutions to authoritarian regimes, and that is corruption and the illicit financial flows that are associated with corruption. Taking steps against the financial enablers in our own societies that permit corruption to flourish elsewhere in the world is an important issue of global collaboration, and one in which the US and EU can admit their own shortcomings and forge important alliances outside the transatlantic circle. And that leads to the final redesign, which is the task for our redesign is to exercise leadership, that very slippery term, without condescension, without domination, and to widen the circle of collaboration on every issue beyond the oligarchy of the major powers. That leadership could be simply providing a focal point for international agreement, or a starting point for international agreement. But it must take account of the complicated universe of activists and stakeholders in contemporary global governance. It would be leadership of a sprawling and fractious coalition, or a series of coalitions, depending on the issue area, that extends well beyond IGOs, intergovernmental organizations, and national governments. And all of this will require a distinct change of mindset on the part of US foreign policymakers, and probably European ones as well. Although in many of these new instruments and approaches to foreign policy, this incorporation of non-state actors, for example, this broadening of the coalition of global governance, the United States can certainly learn from Europe. And finally, what of the pandemic? As I said, it's really too early to tell what effects it will have on global politics, the global economy, global governance in the longer run. The pandemic was clearly a surprise and a shock, and the world responded in a less than ideal way, just as it responded to the earlier shock of the global financial crisis a decade ago. We avoided a complete collapse of international collaboration, but the record has arguably been worse at the global level than it was during the global financial crisis, largely or in part because of the deteriorating United States-China relationship. Nevertheless, the network of central banks and the global economic organizations did respond, and respond relatively effectively. Transnational civil society has remained robust, as the global spread of protests against racism and police violence made clear last summer. There was no clear divide, as I see it, between democracies and authoritarian states in their relative performance in curbing the pandemic. One very clear lesson, however, with considerable significance for global governance, was that despite considerable attention to the prospect of a global pandemic for years before the arrival of the coronavirus, after HIV/AIDS, after SARS, MERS, and Ebola, the world was still unprepared for what should not have been a surprise. The forecasting, prevention, and rapid response dimension of global governments was seriously deficient here, as it has been in other domains. Yet another task before us as we continue to build global governance in our no longer so new century. I think I have time maybe for a very brief anecdote that I wanted to close with. It regards globalization and global governance in a sense, and the pandemic. And it's the development of the Pfizer COVID vaccine, which is a quite remarkable story and suggests that global governance is necessary to provide a space for and enabling of webs of cooperation across national borders and across the Atlantic as well. As you know, Pfizer was the first company to develop a vaccine that was approved for emergency use in the United States. It did not receive direct subsidies from the US government, very much a public-private partnership in the sense, however, that it had guarantees of purchase if it was successful. But the personnel that were involved in this remarkable, and I think it's important to underscore how remarkable this was given what the record had been for past vaccines and how long it had taken to develop them, was the importance of people who moved easily across national borders in the development of this vaccine. It was developed at BioNTech, as you know, a boutique biotech firm in Germany, based in Germany, whose two co-founders and largest shareholders are the children of Turkish immigrants in Germany. Pfizer itself is led by a CEO, 𝗿𝗲𝗷𝗲𝗰𝗁𝗲𝗱, who was born in Greece, and the head of vaccine research and development, Catherine Janssen, at Pfizer, grew up in East Germany. Her family left for West Germany in 1961 with almost nothing. She did a PhD in Germany. She went to the United States. She worked for a while there. She returned to Europe to work at Glaxo in Geneva. She went back to the United States to work for Merck and became a specialist in making vaccines and became truly dedicated to this cause. And she's produced a number of very important vaccines, including Gardasil, which was developed against the a very important virus that causes cervical cancer. And she finally became head of vaccine research at Pfizer after it had purchased Wyeth. And then she led the cooperation, this very transnational individual, between Pfizer, a 170-year-old, nearly 100,000 employees, and BioNTech, which has 1,500 employees, which was surprisingly easy given the scientific background of both sides, which made trust and communication easier from the start. And also, I would argue, the international background on both sides. The trials were conducted internationally under very difficult conditions of pandemic. The first trials were in Germany and the United States. In terms of equipment, Pfizer didn't have some of the equipment, had to purchase it from various global sources. And it conducted late-stage trials around the world in manufacturing, not only in the United States and Europe. It seems to me this vaccine development, as I say, quite a remarkable feat. And one, I ask you to entertain the counterfactual. Where would we be if we did not have the prospect of vaccines for this terrible pandemic and the losses that it's caused? Gives us a sense, as I said, that global governance is important for many reasons, but for one very important reason, that it enables webs of cooperation, private, public, academic, non-academic, across national borders at every level. And that is an enterprise that we will want to keep in mind as we look forward to redesigning global governance in the next decade. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miles. And indeed, you absolutely responded to our expectations. So thank you so much. I think, ladies and gentlemen and colleagues, that we still have time for some Q&A before we have to close our conference with some final concluding remarks. So may I kindly call upon you to use the chat box to type your questions, or to at least indicate that you have a question for our distinguished keynote speaker. So I'm looking around who would like to ask a question. I'm seeing some faces still here, so I wonder whether that means they would like to ask a question. Magdalena, I guess you like to ask a question. Yes, please, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, Jan, for reading from the camera view. Thank you very much for very interesting lecture, Professor Kahler. I have a question about the Summit of Democracy. You've mentioned that one of the conditions of being able to set some standards of cooperation with contesting powers, China, Russia, you mentioned, is some form of organizing democratic community. But we have a problem within a democratic community, and the problem is within the EU. We have countries that are undermining the tenets of liberal democracy by their behavior. And my question to you is, what would be Biden's administration response to that problem that it has with its closest, I hope, allies? Thanks.
Yes, very important. I did mention backsliding in my talk. I didn't name countries, but clearly I had Hungary and Poland in mind. So, but it's more significant than that. I mean, in terms of the crackdown on NGOs, democracies like India and Israel also are, there are question marks there as well. So one of the arguments against this idea, and there have been quite a few people in Washington, one of my colleagues, James 𝗿𝗲𝗷𝗰𝗁 at American University, has written very well on this, who suggests this is really not a very good idea for just the reason you suggest. How do we decide who qualifies to be in this summit of democracies when all of our democracies, or most of our democracies, seem so imperfect at the moment, the United States very prominently among them. So I think it will I suspect it will go forward. President Biden has mentioned it in a number of public speeches. How you would decide the invitation list, how you would decide the agenda, I think is a very problematic issue. I mean, is it going to be, how do we improve our democracies? How do we deepen our democracies ourselves? Or is it to promote democratic principles in other parts of the world? Is it to defend democracies that are under threat, as in Burma or Hong Kong? It's a very, I wouldn't want to be in the position of developing the agenda and the invitation list for this summit, quite frankly. So I have a feeling it's going to be postponed a bit while these things are worked out. It could be that the United States will invite only its closest democratic allies. But then, of course, it does create problems for countries like India, which want to be regarded as part of the, the democratic universe. So I would be very interested to know what you think about this and how it could be configured appropriately, given the problems in Europe and elsewhere.
So this calls for an ongoing dialogue, which I'm sure we will all do also after the formal end of the EUCROSS project. So we have an interesting question in the chat, if I may, from our colleague, Professor Mike Smith. And if I may just quote you, Mike, maybe you want to comment on it yourself. Mike says, I hate to even have to ask this question, but in view of the argument made by Professor Miles Kahler, where might the United Kingdom fit into the new potential processes of global governance? Please, Miles.
Oh yes, I keep forgetting. There has been a change in that regard. Actually, when you convened the project only 18 months ago, Brexit loomed much larger, actually, and now it seems like it's an ongoing and never-ending story, which I have tried to track. Well, I can tell you, the UK is not looming very large in the trade perspective of the Biden administration. From all accounts that I have seen, and I'm basing this not on any insider accounts, but simply media reports, the free trade agreement, which the UK desperately wants with the US, is definitely, I think in the hearings that were held this week by the new US trade representative before the Senate, she said it's not exactly on the back burner, but I don't think it's going ahead at any great speed. And that's a problem for the UK because the US president has the authority to negotiate trade agreements under the trade negotiation authority expires on July 1, I believe, which would make it much more complicated after that fact unless it's renewed to negotiate the UK agreement. So, I think, I don't think the Biden administration is bearing a grudge toward the current government in the UK because of its support of Brexit, but it's clear that, President Obama previously came out against Brexit, argued it was not a good idea. I think the Democrats, the Democratic administration has a sense that in some ways Brexit was part of the same populist nationalist movement that Trump was part of, and Trump clearly saw himself as aligned with Brexit. So that may be coloring attitudes there as well. But I suspect largely for security and national security, intelligence and other reasons, the UK will definitely be folded into whatever wider pattern of cooperation develops between the US and the EU. I just think on trade, I suspect it's going to be slow, as everything regarding trade, as I suggested in my talk, is going to be slow in the Biden administration. Now, you can tell me what sorts of cooperative structures are being developed between the UK and the EU post-Brexit to deal with issues of foreign policy, security, and the like. It seems to me that's a big issue. And the tighter those ties are, then the easier it is for the United States to incorporate the UK in these broader cooperative structures.
How long have you got? Maybe at some later stage.
I welcome hearing what you have to say, definitely.
Well, I'm not the best qualified to talk about this, but my view is that there are an awful lot of areas, including the security area, in which the relationship between the EU and the UK is somewhat thin at the moment.
Right.
And that's not made more positive by the recent appointment of Lord Frost to be the member of the cabinet responsible for relations with the EU. Mm-hmm. I mean, those people who might see a channel for security issues via NATO might have some more positive thoughts about this. I'm not so sure about that either. I think the EU's development of its own security and defence policies is likely to prove a headache for the UK, likely not to lead to very large amounts of cooperation. But that's rather a jaundiced view.
Well, I would ask you about, I forgot to mention, the UK does have a very prominent role coming up in climate.
Yeah.
And that's an area where certainly I think there's alignment with the Biden administration counter to the Trump administration, because the Johnson government has been pro-climate, and the US administration is definitely taking a new tack on climate. So that may provide some opportunities as well.
That might, yeah. Provided the British don't carry on with building the only new coal mine Western Europe for the last 30 years.
Oh,
Anyway, okay, we can leave it there.
Thanks for that, though. I appreciate that.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't see other questions popping up in the chat box. Maybe my chat box is, for one or the other reason, blocked. But I see Kolja is in the picture, so I'm sure he must also have something to ask to Miles.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Miles, for your keynote. It was great pleasure to listen to your elaborations. I remember from some of your earlier writings that you have said that one of the possible ways of thinking about global governance of the future is to think about transformations and to think about non-governmental actors. Perhaps also a little bit along the lines of what Jessica Matthews once wrote about the change of power in global governance, and that non-governmental actors may actually take a much more prominent role in actually setting the tone. Now, you also had the anecdote at the end of your keynote, and it showed, of course, to a certain extent also that the non-governmental actors, including large corporations, may take in certain thematic areas a large role in actually providing solutions to global governance problems. My question is, to which degree does that perhaps always have a response, perhaps even a contradictory or paradoxical response, such as vaccine nationalism these days? To which degree will they always be challenged by states, and states will try to capture such initiatives again and to counter this with more dominant action?
No, well, you have absolutely put your finger on the central question about how global governance will be configured going forward, and what will be the continuing role of states and intergovernmental organizations, which themselves have opened up to non-governmental actors, as you know, very widely in many cases, to varying degrees, and new issue areas where NGOs are taking the lead, or non-governmental actors, both multinational corporations. If you look at global health, I mean, the global health story, the WHO, as you well know, is like a shrinking center of the global health regime. I mean, the Gates Foundation, NGOs, aid donors like the United States, the UK, the EU countries, I mean, all play a much bigger role in the global health in terms of actual resources than the WHO, which is the focal intergovernmental organization. So how do we deal with global governance configurations of that kind? I think is really the big problem going forward. And as you said, states will continue to try to claim the benefits, if you will, of some of these collaborations if they can. And you know, I think one of the tasks of global governance, this gets to the vaccine nationalism point, is to constrain states at least, or to try to posit ways in which states could meet their own interests, but also think about larger interests as well. In the case of vaccine nationalism, it's quite clear, and there have been a number of recent papers by economists in this regard that are striking. If the emerging and developing economies do not recover from the pandemic, the economic effects on the industrialized economies will be very severe. I mean, the degree of global economic growth that now resides in the emerging and developing economies is really very large, even if you exclude China. So to leave them by themselves because of vaccine nationalism, not to assist them with vaccinating their populations, would be very much against the self-interest of the industrialized country. But it requires a longer term, if you will, more enlightened view of your self-interest rather than the short-term, let's grab the vaccines as much as we can and keep them within our borders. And I do think this is a big, I mean, for the EU and the United States, once again, to reassert themselves as a model for the world, making vaccine availability a serious part of this. I mean, President Macron raised this issue with Biden. China and Russia are moving with vaccines. I'm not sure it's going to change the attitudes of countries dramatically over time, but it certainly doesn't help if the US and the EU are seen as hoarding vaccines and not assisting through COVAX and other means to see that vaccinations take place promptly in the rest of the world. But there's also an issue just in terms of enlightened self-interest. And in many ways, I think the other actors in global governance, whether it's multinational corporations, certainly NGOs, private foundations, is to convince governments of what that longer term self-interest is and argue for it domestically.
Okay, I'm looking around to see if there are any other questions. If not, I see some people here, but I'm not sure they want to speak up. Let me just say something myself, and then maybe in the chat, if somebody who really would like to ask a question can also give me a sign in the chat. Miles, you were talking about the strengthening of transnational civil society engagement as one of the ways of like, you know, also redesigning and in a certain way also making engagement more durable. And I kind of remember, I think an op-ed was written recently by Anne-Marie Slaughter about exactly that same point. But so, and given the fact that we in Europe, we are a little bit afraid that we can again count on America being back for the next 3.5 years, but we don't know for afterward. Through what means can we make such a transnational civil society engagement more firmly embedded in the international system? It's really, really a difficult question, but I'm sure you're up to the job.
No, it is a very difficult question because, as I suggested in my remarks, building up this transnational network of CSOs has positive effects for global governance, but it also is an indirect way of challenging authoritarian governments, because I think they're very uncomfortable. China clearly is very uncomfortable with global governance structures that include civil society organizations. In fact, in some cases in climate, I mean, in global health, they actually created NGOs because they were required to create NGOs to participate in certain forums. So, so indirectly, they can serve as, if you will, an instrument in challenging authoritarianism as well as strengthening global governance. But the difficult task is, how shall I say, aligning oneself, if you're a national government or an intergovernmental organization, aligning yourself with NGOs without having the NGOs being seen as your instruments. Because if they're seen as your instruments, well, then that undercuts their credibility, their legitimacy in many ways in what they're about. And we're back to the kind of Cold War problem where you had, you know, the infiltration of civil society organizations and political parties on either side. I mean, that is already a risk, and we certainly don't want on the democratic side to engage in that sort of activity. But on the other hand, we clearly have interests that are aligned with many civil society organizations. So alignment, collaboration without domination, and without having them be seen as instruments of foreign governments or intergovernmental organizations is the trick. And that's a very difficult trick to pull out, as we've seen in the case of India. So India has used, against environmental activists, the argument that they are agents of foreign governments or they're agents of foreign societies. Greenpeace is seen, you know, as something that's outside of India, even though there's a local Greenpeace. And many governments, as I mentioned, even democratic governments, on certain issues have begun to take that line, which we need to push back against, I think, as much as we can, and make that definitely part of our conversations with these governments. But you put once again, you centered on a very important subject as we think about this, what I call this kind of fractious, sprawling coalitions that have developed around issues like climate and global health and human rights. How do governments act within those coalitions? And Anne-Marie has been writing about this a long time. Anne-Marie and I have collaborated on thinking about networks and thinking about it in terms of a network in which national governments are part of a network is one useful way, I think, of dealing with this. But as I said, that would require a real change of mindset on the part of major governments, I think. They're not used to operating this way. The EU, I think, is more used to operating in this way and could teach us something about these techniques. But you may disagree on that. You are more expert on that.
It's an interesting question to be addressed, I think, also with regard to the EU. Indeed, officially, the EU likes to engage a lot with, say, civil society actors, and it's doing that seriously, both internally and in its external relations. But I guess there is more here also to be, let's say, explored, because indeed, a civil society organization may very, very quickly feel itself to be instrumentalized. And that's not actually what you really want.
Exactly.
There needs to be a sense of ownership, really. Okay, I don't see any other questions from our distinguished participants. So if you would allow me to do so, I'm going to make a bit kind of concluding reflections of the day. Don't expect les grandes conclusions générales du colloque. I mean, it will not be really like that. Just a couple of, let's say, specific and punctual kind of reflections. I think that our two panels and the great keynote lecture by Miles have shown that global governance indeed is linked and influenced by an ongoing interdependence on the one hand, and geopolitical rivalry on the other hand. And yeah, the European Union has to cooperate with partners in order to achieve certain global governance objectives. And that's also what, when I can play a little with my lawyer's hat, that is also what is written down in the EU Treaty, in Article 21 of the Treaty on European Union, which indeed mentions that the EU wants to work together with other partners with a view to good global governance. But that's, of course, a bit difficult, because on the one hand, you have to cooperate with partners to achieve those objectives, while on the other hand, being contested by some of the same partners in question. Let's go back to Russia. In spite of a somewhat difficult recent visit to Moscow, it's clear that we will have to continue to engage in cooperation with Russia on a number of issues. But then on the other hand, for Russia, issues such as state sovereignty, equality of states is a must, and that it does absolutely not accept any interference in what it calls its domestic affairs. How to handle that in the future. China is also both at the same time a systemic rival, as the EU in a communication has recently admitted for the very first time, and so in that sense also an economic competitor. But on the other hand, we really need China to work together with in a number of, say, multilateral frameworks. Climate change is an obvious area, but I think there are plenty of other areas, although it's very difficult, as we have seen in the previous panel, when China is trying to use the UN system to let's say, steer through its own, say, value kind of objectives, when it is trying to change a little bit the human rights discourse and so on. That, in a way, clashes rather directly with the EU's conviction about fundamental values. Now, and still we're dealing with China because, as we have seen and as we have discussed today, there is this recent comprehensive investment agreement between the EU and China, where I have the impression that something like a little storm is building up, and we may still see quite a number of interesting developments prior to a final, say, ratification of that investment agreement. But in any event, at the least you can say it shows the economic importance of China, shows also, let's say, the deep urge and sense of pragmatic sense of some of our EU member states, not to mention the German presidency, who pushed through this deal, that they really want to, you know, economically cooperate with such countries. And so that we will have to look indeed how to balance our values vis-a-vis this need for further deep economic cooperation. There's the case of Western Africa, which shows the geopolitical competition of actors such as China and Turkey, and the European Union's concerns and challenges in responding strategically to that. And then we come back to the United States, which, as Miles has so eloquently said, is re-strategizing. But we will have to see how similar the objectives of the United States and the European Union can be. Are both partners aiming to take the lead in reshaping the global order through their cooperation? Could it be, and now I'm really putting a very naive kind of perspective, but could it be, as Alexandra said, the re-election of Gutierrez as Secretary General, the small window of a number of years that we have to maybe meaningfully reform the United Nations system? Could it happen? Could we seize that occasion and opportunity? I'm not exactly sure, but we know we have a very heavy responsibility in that respect. So, but in any event, it remains to be seen on which issues the US and the European Union will be able to push the global agenda, and on which others they may have some, well, minor or major disagreements. Let me also point in that respect to the fact that we are going to launch very soon, that is on Tuesday, the 9th of March, a transatlantic lecture series on the US and the EU, a new momentum, ? And the kickoff lecture on the 9th of March will be done by, it's both a European and an American. We have Ambassador Dirk Wouters, the previous Belgian ambassador to Washington, D.C., and Andrea Kendall-Taylor from the Center for a New American Security, who will kick off and really start discussing about the opportunities and challenges with regard to EU-US cooperation. And that transatlantic lecture series will last throughout the spring. It's actually an initiative of the newly established America-Europe Fund at KU Leuven, which is hosted in the Global Governance Center in KU Leuven. So, I mean, that's coming in the future, but let me also mention that the EU's response to the challenges of global contestation and the need for cooperation have also, as we have seen, especially last week, led to ample new communications, joint communications on trade, on transatlantic relations already in December, very early, on multilateralism, 17th of February last week, and much more. And all of that could be seen as really efforts at an EU strategic response to the challenges which the contestation of the global order is facing. And on the one hand, the European Union is clearly underlying the importance of global governance and multilateral global governance institutions. That's very clear. But yeah, on the other hand, the EU also nowadays, much more strongly than in the past, I would say, underlines the need for a multilateralism that can deliver. And also that the EU would not be contributing to multilateralism just for the sake of it, as we were sometimes accused of in the past. Now, what does that mean? It becomes evident that the EU's interests, especially in trade and investment policies, are driving more, I think, than in the past, the EU's global action. Yesterday at our university, we had a distinguished ambassadorial lecture by the Japanese ambassador to Belgium and NATO in Brussels. And at a certain moment, when we asked him a question about, say, the EU's newfound sense of geopolitical and, let's say, autonomy and so on, at a certain moment, the Japanese ambassador really mentioned that he was a little bit concerned that the EU may start developing a bit of an European Union first policy. Now, that's an interesting thing to dig into at a future occasion, I would think. So, I mean, on the one hand, we see a stronger sense of interests, of geopolitical, say, actions and strategies. On the other hand, it is also clear that the EU will continue to go for the respect and the promotion of fundamental values such as the human rights, democratic values, human dignity, the rule of law. And indeed, it is true that these are universal values. But of course, as we all know, they may be universal in nature, but there are very different interpretations of those values also within the international community and among our strategic partners, even between the US and the EU, there are notable differences with regard to the way in which we interpret certain human rights, such as, for instance, the freedom of expression, or questions such as the death penalty, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, how do we either bring those things together? Where may be the trade-offs? Where may be the sources of tensions? And last but not least, when we talk about the EU that wants to really contribute to global governance, how and where will it find support for global initiatives? It's not an easy matter. There have been some interesting case studies in the past about former EU initiatives that really did not lead to global outcomes. And I think we have learned maybe some lessons from that, but the discussions today also have shown that there may be potential through various initiatives that are linked to the EU's connectivity strategy. At the same time, also the EU's role and leadership in international organizations, including the United Nations, will need to be enhanced. And that's the good news of the latest joint communication, is that finally the need for enhancing the EU position and role within the United Nations system has really explicitly been recognized. And I hope, as some of our colleagues, including 𝗿𝗲𝗀𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗍𝗏, have said during the second panel, I hope indeed that that joint communication is just the beginning, a kind of kickoff, and that we will become more concrete also with regard to a strategy to upgrading the EU's position in a great number of multilateral institutions. But even here, the EU may become, more vocal, may become more actively engaged and assertive within international organizations. But we all know that with 27 member states, you're only 27 out of a total of a General Assembly of 193 countries, or in a total of 156 WTO members. So wherever we are within global multilateral organizations, we will have to do cross-regional outreach and become even better at that than we have already become. And so that indeed requires really building relationships, building support, and really trying to, in that sense, go beyond our own European positions and be more flexible in that respect. So, my friends, this was our final conference for the EUCROSS project. We hope sincerely that you have enjoyed this conference. It's always great to engage with so many distinguished speakers, some of which in the meantime, I guess, have gone to bed because from the East, at least I would imagine that it's now very, very late. It's a bit less late in the West, and especially in, say, the Americas. But let me again, on behalf of the whole EUCROSS consortium, thank you all for your engagement. Thank our partners for a wonderful project. Thank the European Union and the Commission for its support. And stay tuned with the initiatives of our Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies. As indeed was remarked, multilateralism is always at the core of what we're doing in our Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies. So we will definitely be back with initiatives, including the upcoming Transatlantic Lecture series. Thank you very much, and have a very good evening, night, or almost morning. Thank you. Bye-bye.